G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we are doing our final punt series guide. We're punting points. We're going to learn how to do it, what to avoid, and finish it off with a mock draft. Let's go!
Jordan open. Chicago with the lead. Bryant to shot.
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life. Anything's possible.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang! Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York. We the North are now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day and welcome again to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. And like we said, this is the final punt strategy guide series, video episode podcast that we're going to be doing. And we're talking about punting points. Now, if you haven't already, feel free to go and check out our punt assists, our punt field goal percentage, our punt free throw percentage videos, and also our general punt strategy guide podcast as well. They are all part of this little mini-series where we are learning how to master the punting strategy in fantasy basketball, which is a big strategy that I'm a huge fan of, especially when it comes to head-to-head leagues in category leagues. So now, if you're a points league player, these videos don't apply to you. Obviously, you're not going to be punting points in a points league. You want to get the most amount of points possible. But in a category league, the punt point strategy is one that is often underappreciated, underused, and I think it is undervalued as well. And we're going to talk about exactly what the advantages, disadvantages, how to do it, what to avoid, and a mock draft at the end of today. So let's get stuck into it straight away. If you have enjoyed these punt series as well, guys, make sure you please give this video a thumbs up and make sure you guys are subscribed as well, so that you guys, we've got heaps coming up in this preseason before the NBA season starts, and plenty once the season gets going. So let's get into it. Punting points. What are the advantages? The main advantage is that everybody loves points. Points. They're the biggest thing that people are drawn to when looking at a stat sheet. They're the number one thing that when we are considering our players, it's the first category that we look at. It often, when we're talking about fantasy basketball, it is the category that takes priority over other categories because the second point here, because it is so hard to find in big volume after the first 4 rounds, because a lot of the best players in fantasy basketball score a lot of points. So if you are not competitive in that category in the first third of the draft, it's more than likely that you're not going to be able to make up that category because you're not going to be able to find a 25 point per game scorer in the 8th round or the 9th round. And if you are, they're going to provide you 0 other categories help. So you're going to be giving up a lot of other things in that respect. So when we talk about points, it is by far the most difficult category to build later on. It is also the category that most people want to be competitive in, because if we're talking about punting field goal percentage or punting free throw percentage, punting assists, all these categories rely on you being strong in points to beat other teams that are maybe punting similar categories or different categories. It seems to always be the category that a few things come down to. So when you ignore it, you're looking at a very different board compared to a lot of other people going into the draft. And that, at the end of the day, is the whole point and whole value of punting in general. So it's not often done. It's probably one of the least common punting strategies out there. And for that reason, it can have a big advantage as well. So the other thing I also really like about punting points is that there are lots of different pairings of different categories that work effectively. You can punt points and threes. You can punt points and free throw percentage. You could punt points, and you could also punt something like, what was I going to say? Assists as well. So there's a few different ways you can pair them together, and a few different builds that, you know, if you wanted to lean in more into the big guys, lean more into the guards, you can definitely do that. And still be very successful in this one. You don't sort of feel like you're it's less likely you're going to accidentally find yourself punting 4 different categories in a build like this. Like some of the other ones that we've talked about so far, you've still got a bit more leeway and options to move around as well. And also on top of this, I find that you're naturally going to be better, more competitive in turnovers, and naturally going to be better in defensive stats. Those two things often pair really well with this punt strategy, because if players aren't out there scoring, they've got to be providing value to NBA teams somehow, and usually it is in being efficient. It's usually in being a really good defensive player, and often when they don't have the ball in their hands a lot and they're not scoring a lot, they also are not turning the ball over as well. So naturally, you'll find those 2 categories, or those 3 categories, I should say, are better in this type of punt build without having to worry about it too much. What about the disadvantages, and why don't people go to punting points more often? Because of, there's a few good advantages there. Why don't people do it more often? In my opinion, it's the hardest punt strategy to wrap your head around, because like we sort of said, everyone loves points. We always, we are drawn to it. But on top of that, like we said, the best players in fantasy basketball score points. So when we talk about punting it as a category, there is a lot of an idea of saying, okay, I've got to get players who don't score a lot of points, but that's not exactly the right mindset for this category. And we're going to talk about that when we go to look at the best players, or the top 25, and their weaknesses in points, and who had that as their worst category. And there's a bit of a lesson in that one there as well. But it's the hardest one to wrap your head around. And when we go through this strategy guide video today, I'm hoping that you'll leave after watching this or listening to this and sort of have a better understanding on the exact strategy of what we're trying to be doing here, because I think a few people may have tried it in the past and probably gone about it the wrong way, or attacked it or thought about it from the beginning in the wrong sense, and that's kind of led to the downfall in terms of execution. But when it's executed properly, we can do really good things. And then I also, probably the main, I guess, objective disadvantage to this one is that it can, because you're targeting players that might not necessarily score in bunches and score high volumes and get shots up, you are often more susceptible to fluctuations in your percentages. So, for example, when I get someone like a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander who scores me 32 points, but he also gets to the line 10, 11 times a game. He has a great field goal percentage on 20 attempts. So that provides me a bit more insulation with my percentages, that even if some of my other players having a down week or whatever, if he's having a hot week and he's shooting a really high percentage, he's doing it on high volume. So that's going to protect me from those natural kind of ups and downs throughout the regular season that do occur. If I don't have those kind of heavy hitters at the start of my draft, those kind of small fluctuations can be more felt more with a team that doesn't have those kind of players. So that is definitely something to consider when we're doing a punt point strategy, and is probably one of the disadvantages of this particular punt builds. All right, let's look at, like we talked about just before, the top 25 players from last year who had the points category as their worst category in fantasy basketball. And the answer here, as people can see on the screen already, the answer is nobody. There is no one in the top 25 fantasy contributors last year that their worst contribution in fantasy was points. In fact, the only player, actually, that I would have to go down as far as, I don't think there's anyone else inside the top 100. Draymond Green, even his worst category was threes made. So he, even though you think about him as an 8.5 points per game scorer, his worst category was threes. In fact, I don't think inside the top 100. Oh no, I found someone. It was Delon Wright, who last year put up 7.4 points per game. His worst category was points. But outside of him, no one else inside the top 100 had points as their lowest category in terms of, contributing to their overall fantasy stat set. So when we're thinking about punting points, we're not thinking about trying to draft players where points are their worst category, because you won't find them. What we're trying to consider when we're punting points is the difference between the player you're drafting at that position and the other players being drafted around that position. So not necessarily their total points value, but the I guess relative value to the people around them. So, for example, when I look at the first round, if I look at the best ranked players in fantasy basketball last year. We've got players like Embiid, we've got players like Jokic, we've got players, let me go through the first round actually, let me get myself sorted as I pull up this list here. We've got Jokic, Embiid, Shea, Kevin Durant, Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard, Steph Curry, Kyrie Irving, Tyrese Halliburton, Jason Tatum, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Jimmy Butler. Now, of those players, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, nearly 5 players that are scoring 30 points per night. We've got an extra 1, 2, 3 players scoring over 25 points per night. And then we've got a few players that are in the lower 20s. So you would say someone who's scoring 20 points per game, that's still a very good positive contribution to points. Great. But in the first round, when you compare them to some of those other guys who are scoring 30 points, you're already basically 10 points behind those other guys. And for me to then go into the second round, and if they're drafting someone who still scores 20 points, I've got to get a guy who's scoring 30 points for me to break even with those teams. So that's when we talk about it being the hardest category to catch up and make up, because when we have those guys in the first round that are so dominant in that category, and you're getting a guy who's 10 points away from them, it's difficult to make up because you're not going to get many opportunities to make that, to catch that up. And often it leads to guys who do put up big points going earlier than what their overall value should actually allow. So when you draft someone like a Tyrese Halliburton who scores 21 points per game, but you're drafting him instead of getting a Steph Curry who scores 30, that's when you sort of start to go, okay, even though he scores 20 points per game, that's great. I'm going to punt points because instead of me chasing 30 points in my next round, round 2 or round 3, I'm going to just get the next guy who's still really good value. Maybe he doesn't score as much as these other guys, or maybe, he might score 20, 25 points per game, but it's still not enough for me to catch up with those other guys who drafted Embiid or drafted Shea or drafted, someone like Damian Lillard, for example, or all these other guys, Jason Tatum, who are scoring 30 a night. So that key distinction, I think, is very important for us to really appreciate, that we're not looking for poor point scorers, but we're just mindful of where the player that we're drafting in that round, what his scoring is like compared to the other people being drafted around him. So make sure, if you forget everything else, I think that's the main takeaway when considering the punt points strategy. All right, so let's talk about the players who benefit the most inside the top 100, because obviously players who don't score any points benefit great, because obviously, you're not worried about that, but they are all probably down the list in the rankings. So of the top 100, Tyrese Halliburton, Jaren Jackson Jr., Nicholas Claxton, Fred VanVleet, James Harden, Brook Lopez, Miles Turner, Walker Kessler, Chris Paul, and OG Anunoby. Now, when we look at that list, the main thing that sticks out to me, compared to the other lists that we talked about with punting assists, field goal percentage, free throw percentage, of this list, this is by far the most balanced of all of the guys who benefit the most in a particular punt build. We've got 4 guards, we've got 5 bigs, and we've got 1 wing in OG Anunoby in this list, whereas the assists, for example, all 10 of them were guards. All 10 of them were bigs. In the punt field goal percentage, they were all guards. In the punt free throw percentage, most of them were bigs, with a couple of exceptions. So that leads me to think that there is a nice balanced approach with this punt strategy, that I can get different stat sets at different points in the draft that makes my team more competitive in 6 or 7 categories, versus having to be very careful to make sure that I don't accidentally punt 4 categories and find myself in a situation that I didn't quite plan for. So, if you get a Tyrese Halliburton early, you don't have to then follow it up with a big man. You could get a guard. You could go a big man, because you might be able to get a few of those guys later in the draft. All these players in this list, are spread out throughout the draft fairly reasonably. So it definitely is an advantage of this category and this punt strategy. So let's move on to the common mistakes that people make. So again, like we sort of spoke about before, the best players in fantasy basketball, they score a lot of points. So the biggest mistake is you're ignoring players who score lots of points. So remember, we're not trying to be the worst team at scoring. We are just simply trying to be the team that ignores that as the main contributor. Like we sort of said, as one of the negatives in this category, the percentages are really vital when doing this strategy because you're not going to have that insulation naturally when you're ignoring the points scoring because you're not as caught up in high volume, high usage players. So those players tend to swing a little bit more week to week, a bit more volatile in the percentages. So making sure that you might need to get someone who scores a lot of points because he does that and he does that efficiently and he insulates you in high free throw percentage volume, high field goal percentage volume. He scores a lot of points. That's not too valuable to you, but those other categories are really valuable. So again, if we're just trying to focus on those guys who are lower point scorers, maybe they get a lot of assists or steals or blocks, but that leaves your percentages quite vulnerable to a lot of volatility during the season. So that's definitely a big one and one that we'll focus in on when we do some mock drafts today and in the future as well. And then the last thing here I've got is kind of an opposite to the few things that we talked about the last time and not identifying the need to punt other categories soon enough. So sometimes the risk in the other ones is you find yourself accidentally punting 4 categories because the guards have all been elevated in a punt field goal percentage build, so you've not looked after your rebounds, blocks, or turnovers as well. So you've got 4 categories that you've sort of left by the wayside. This one here, sometimes we get caught out in trying to do and take on too much because we're punting points. Maybe we're trying to look after both percentages equally, which can be tough to do. Maybe we're trying to look after our turnovers a little bit too much. Maybe we're trying to look after our threes a little bit too much, and it can be a hard balance between having good 3-point performance and good field goal percentage. So we might have to pick and choose one of those 2 categories. So just being aware of when to cut bait with certain other categories to pair it with the punt point strategy. That's really important to make sure that you're on top of as well because, punting one category is great, but I think often we've got to try and choose 2 categories to punt. Turnovers might not be the best one to go with this build. Maybe it is like a field goal percentage, a free throw percentage, or a threes. Like those are kind of the ones that we might be looking at as well as depending on where and what players fall to you at different spots in the draft. So I think that one is another big one to stay on top of when we are talking about mistakes that people make. Make sure that you're not afraid to also punt something else if the opportunity does arise. All right, let's move on into going over to Basketball Monster, which we have been doing in these last couple of episodes. All right, we should be over here on Basketball Monster now. So let's have a look. Okay, we're going to punt the points here. Again, I might just refresh Basketball Monster. Sometimes it kicks me off. Okay, no, we're all good. So we're punting the points category here, and we are also, like always, putting the turnovers to 0.25. Now, similar to the punt assist build, we are probably going to be naturally very high or good in turnovers, i.e. low in turnovers, because again, we're getting low usage players and they tended to not turn the ball over too much. So again, though, when we look at the rankings from last year, we often think of Tyrese Halliburton as a guy who, benefits in a punt strategy like this, but he's still only 8th in rankings from last year. You're still looking at players like Jokic, Embiid, Durant, Shea, Anthony Davis, Steph Curry, Lillard, all these guys are still up there. James Harden boosts up. And you'll notice here on the gain from punts section over here, they're all negatives, right? Because all these players at the start still score a lot of points, but they're still high enough up the board that they're going to be still the best players to draft early on. So it's not until we come down to a player like Brook Lopez do we actually see someone gain anything from it, but even he only gains, 0.1. It's more about the players who lose more and the players who lose less. That creates the value, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily about increasing the value about players, but it's about devaluing other players that score a lot. I hope that makes a lot of sense, but it's a slightly different way to think about it when we're talking about this strategy compared to some of the field goal percentage or free throw percentage categories as well. So I just think that's a nice, interesting thing to point out there. So for this mock draft, again, we're going to I think of these players that are going to go into the first round this season, I think Tyrese Halliburton is definitely one. I think I'd be pretty happy to draft over a Dame, a Steph, an Anthony Davis, and a Kevin Durant just because of some of those risk factors. And if we talk about the punt value over here, league value, he's at 1.09. Remember, I think he also gets some advantage because he does turn the ball over fewer than some of these other guys. So by also putting that turnovers down to 0.25, his value is not quite as high. But that we will reap the benefit of that moving forward. So say we're drafting him, at pick 5 or 6, I think is probably about where I'd be looking at him. He's someone that I would straight away be kind of thinking, okay, he's scoring maybe 21, 22 points per game compared to Shea, who's scoring close to 30, compared to Jokic, who, maybe he's a candidate as well, but he's still scoring about 25, so 3 to 5 more than us. Embiid scoring nearly, more than 10 points than we are. Lillard later in the draft is, he scored 32 points last year. So these guys are going to outscore me. If I come now down to the second round, again, it's going to be a similar kind of list of players here. But now I can start to target players that might start to move up. Now, Jaren Jackson Jr., he might be going a little bit earlier by the time I can get him. But if he falls, he would be a perfect player for me because, again, probably not going to score much more than 20 points per game, which, again, still good. But compared to some of these other guys like a Kawhi Leonard, like a Donovan Mitchell, like a Paul George later on, all these kind of players later, Trae Young, for example, he's not going to be scoring anywhere near as much, but he's going to give me elite blocks. He's going to give me elite threes, good percentages in my free throws, good percentages in my field goal, gives me a steal per game as well. So he's kind of the perfect guy. If he is not there, then we might look at someone else. Now, again, we want to shore up our percentages. So we might look at someone maybe like a Kyrie Irving, who sometimes slips in the second round. He's still one that benefit. You think about Kyrie, he scores 27 points per game. He's a great player in this build. He's excellent in his field goal. He's a really good anchor for our free throw percentage as well. Gives us good steals, rebounds for a guard, 5.5 assists. So don't feel like you have to avoid players that score 27 points per game. And again, this is another thing that you can kind of not lock yourself into. If you find that guys that is scoring well are falling in your draft, you might find yourself actually decently competitive in points. It's just simply valuing players without that, and you might look at the board a little bit differently. So Kyrie Irving's definitely someone we could consider. Maybe you might consider someone like a Domantas Sabonis. Again, really good field goal percentage anchor, great assists and rebounds guy. His free throw percentage has slowly improved over time, but again, still something we need to take into account. It's not a huge negative. It's not one of those big red numbers, so I think it's maintainable and manageable. Lacks the threes, but we could probably get that a little bit later, so he's a good candidate. And then probably a little early for Miles Turner. You might be able to get him in the third, and a few of these other guys might also be available in the third. So really, we're looking at some of those guys, maybe a Jimmy Butler, but the second round probably doesn't change all that much. Maybe you're looking a bit more at a Fred VanVleet in Houston. Again, the percentages is field goals. We're going to have to make sure we look at that, but there are a few guys. Field goal percentage is probably a little bit more fixable later than a poorer free throw percentage, because you do get some guys at the back end of the draft that put up some really good field goal percentage. If we look down a little bit further into the third round, we might now start to be able to look at players like a Miles Turner. If you want to really go early on someone like a Walker Kessler in this type of a build, this is where I don't mind it as much. Again, be aware of the free throw percentage and the lack of assists and steals and things like that might be where you start to think about maybe some other punts. But if you start out with the Halliburton, those assists are a little bit more manageable. You will look at someone like a Claxton. Again, big negative in free throw percentage, something that with our build is going to be harder to deal with. So you might either start to look at a punt free throw percentage and a punt points build. Definitely a play. Doesn't shoot a lot of threes. So if we, haven't drafted, we went Sabonis, Claxton, threes are looking pretty poor at that stage. So again, do you start to look at punt threes, points, free throw percentage? Potentially, it could definitely be an option. So he's someone to consider. Someone like a, Vucevic boosts up a little bit. I'm a little bit down on Vucevic this year, just in general. Who else have we got here? So you'll look and see Booker's down a little bit. So he's not someone too valuable to us. Trae Young's down a little bit. So again, not too valuable. Anthony Edwards. is down a little bit. Look, Brook Lopez is there. This is the last season's numbers. I'm expecting him to progress a little bit, so we're going to ignore him there. But you can probably start to look at players even like a Chet Holmgren is another guy who wouldn't be on this list because this is last year's rankings. He's definitely someone to consider at this point as well. Really good across the board. Doesn't score a lot of points, but should be solid. Won't hurt your percentages. OG Anunoby, again, really good steals. Great threes, should maybe feel like he gets more assists this year with no Fred VanVleet there. So we've got a few options, and then in the fourth round, we'll have bigs kind of throughout the whole draft that we can look at. Players like a Rudy Gobert, like a Mitchell Robinson. Again, these are those guys that really do give us some really big boost to our field goal percentage. So that's why I feel more comfortable getting someone like a Fred VanVleet in this situation earlier than someone like Claxton, for example, who's probably equal or close to equal in negatives field goal percentage versus free throw percentage, but I feel better about making that up than I do than making up the the free throw percentage. So that's something also to keep in mind. So again, we're not targeting those players that score really poorly. We are targeting guys that do give us a lot of other things, though, in terms of your rebounds, your assists, your steals, your blocks, your field goal percentage, your free throw percentage, threes. It's a really, really nice strategy, I think, in my mind, but it is probably, again, harder to wrap your head around. And again, just be aware of those percentages, because without those high volume, high usage players, you will find yourself potentially being a bit more susceptible to volatility week to week in a head-to-head setting. So tell me what you think about the punt point strategy. Have I convinced any of you guys to give it a try this year if you've never given it a try last year? I did a punt point strategy in the FBI World Cup last year when I started with Atari's Halliburton. Did pretty well, got through the first round, got knocked out in the second round by a very interesting punt guards team, which got me in steals at the end of the day. But yeah, I think it's definitely a viable strategy, and the more practice you do, I think the better you'll get at it, and it can be quite powerful. So let us know what you think down in the comments below, guys. If you enjoyed this punt series, give me a big thumbs up in the video, and make sure you guys are subscribed. Next week, we're going to be doing our first mock draft. I'm going to be having the great Josh Lloyd joining us on the show. We're also going to be going and previewing some really early sleepers, busts, and some deep sleepers, some late round flyers that we might be able to have a look at. Things might change, but always good to get an early look on where things are. So if you guys are enjoying it, again, make sure you subscribe. Give us a 5-star rating and review over on Apple Podcasts as well. Stay tuned to me on Twitter. The season guide is coming out soon, and we'll catch you guys next time. Bye.